The journal was tucked inside a box of old gardening tools in my father's garage, discovered when I was helping clear out his house after he'd moved to assisted living, following a stroke that had left him unable to care for himself independently. The leather cover was worn and water-stained, the pages yellowed and filled with my father's distinctive handwriting. Entries dated from 1992 through 2006 that documented a daily life I knew nothing about despite having lived with him through most of those years. The first entry I read described taking his daughter Emma to her piano lesson on a Tuesday afternoon, helping her practice scales and encouraging her when she got frustrated with a difficult passage. And I felt disoriented because I was my father's only daughter, and my name wasn't Emma, and I'd never taken piano lessons in my life. I kept reading, moving through entries that mentioned a son named Michael, who played Little League baseball, a wife named Catherine who worked as a nurse at New Hanover Regional Medical Center, and addresses on Market Street, and then later on Greenfield Street, both in Wilmington, North Carolina, the same city where I'd grown up believing I was my father's only child in a family that consisted of just him and my mother and me. The journal entries were mundane and domestic, recording the small moments that constitute family life, birthday parties and school concerts, and weekend trips to the beach at Wrightsville. Conversations about homework and household repairs and plans for summer vacations. My father wrote about Emma's progress in piano, about Michael's struggles with math homework, about Catherine's long shifts at the hospital, and how they managed childcare and household responsibilities around her unpredictable schedule. He wrote about loving Catherine, about the life they'd built together, about feeling grateful for the family they'd created, even as he acknowledged in occasional entries that the situation was complicated in ways he couldn't fully explain even to himself in the privacy of his journal. There were references to the other house and my other life that made it clear my father was maintaining two separate households, two complete families that existed simultaneously in the same city, on streets that were less than 2 miles apart, according to the addresses he'd noted in various entries when recording directions to soccer fields or planning routes for errands that needed to accommodate both families' schedules without ever allowing them to intersect or discover each other's existence. Wilmington spreads along the Cape Fear River, where it meets the Atlantic Ocean, a coastal city that has grown from a colonial port town into a sprawling metropolitan area that encompasses historic downtown districts, suburban developments from every era of the past 70 years, and beach communities that stretch north and south along the barrier islands. The streets where my father had apparently maintained his two families were in the Midtown area, a section of the city that had developed in the 1970s and 1980s with middle-class subdivisions and commercial strips, neighborhoods of brick ranches and split-level houses where families with modest incomes could afford to own property and raise children in relative comfort and safety. By the time I started investigating the addresses from my father's journal, both neighborhoods had aged and changed. Some houses renovated and expanded while others had fallen into disrepair. The overall character of the areas reflecting the economic pressures and demographic shifts that had transformed Wilmington over the past 2 decades as tourism and film industry money had raised property values and pushed working families farther from the center of the city. If you want to discover how my father maintained two complete families less than 2 miles apart for 14 years without either family knowing about the other, subscribe now, because what I found in Wilmington will reveal the impossible logistics of double lives and the devastating impact when those carefully constructed separations finally collapse. I started with the address on Market Street, where the journal indicated my father had lived with Catherine and the children from 1992 until 1998, a brick ranch that had been recently renovated with new siding and landscaping that completely transformed its appearance from the modest house visible in photographs tucked between journal pages. The current owners were a young couple who'd bought the property in 2019, and they had no information about previous residents beyond what had been disclosed in the sale documents. But they mentioned that the neighbors on both sides were original residents who'd been on the street since the 1980s, and might remember the families who'd lived in the house over the years. I knocked on the door to the left, and an elderly woman named Margaret Powell invited me inside when I explained I was researching my family history and believed relatives might have lived next door in the 1990s. Margaret said she remembered the family who'd occupied that house during those years, a nurse named Catherine, who'd worked nights at the hospital, and her husband, whose name she thought was David or Daniel, though she admitted her memory wasn't what it used to be, and she might be confusing details from different neighbors across 30 years of watching families come and go on the street. Margaret said Catherine had been friendly but busy, always rushing between work and home responsibilities, and the husband had been around regularly but had kept odd hours that Margaret had attributed to shift work or a job that required flexible scheduling. She remembered 2 children, a girl who'd practiced piano endlessly to the point where the music had been audible through the walls, and a boy who'd been obsessed with baseball and had spent hours in the backyard practicing his swing and throwing balls against a pitchback net that had driven Margaret crazy with its repetitive thumping sound. Margaret said the family had seemed normal and happy, had participated in neighborhood events, and had maintained their property well, and she'd been surprised when they'd moved suddenly in 1998 with only a few weeks' notice and no explanation beyond vague mentions of job relocations that required them to leave Wilmington. She said Catherine had seemed distressed during those final weeks, had lost weight, and had looked exhausted in ways that went beyond her usual fatigue from hospital shifts, and Margaret had wondered at the time if there were problems in the marriage or financial troubles that were forcing the family to relocate. But she'd never asked directly, and Catherine had never volunteered any information beyond the minimal pleasantries that neighbors exchange. I showed Margaret photographs from the journal, images of my father with 2 children who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old, and she confirmed that those were the children she remembered from next door, that the girl in the picture was definitely the piano player and the boy was the baseball enthusiast. Margaret studied the photograph of my father and said yes, that was Catherine's husband, though he'd looked different than in the picture, had worn his hair shorter, and had carried more weight. But the face was the same, and she was certain he was the man who'd lived next door with Catherine and the children. I asked if Margaret had ever seen the man with other people who might have been family members from outside the household, and she said no, that he'd been private and had never introduced anyone as relatives or had visitors that she'd noticed, though of course she wasn't watching the house constantly and couldn't account for everyone who might have come and gone during the 6 years that family had lived there. Margaret asked why I was interested in this particular family, and I found myself unable to explain that the man in the photograph was my father, and that discovering he'd had a second family had upended everything I thought I understood about my childhood and my family's history. So I said only that I was trying to piece together information about relatives I'd lost touch with, and was hoping to reconnect with people who might remember them. The second address from the journal was on Greenfield Street, where entries indicated my father had moved Catherine and the children in 1998, and where they'd apparently lived until the journal entries stopped in 2006. The house was a split level with a 2-car garage, larger than the Market Street property, and in a slightly more upscale neighborhood with bigger lots and newer construction. The current residents were an older couple who'd bought the house in 2010 from a bank that had foreclosed on the previous owners, and they said they'd never met the people who'd lived there before the foreclosure, and had no information about the house's history before their purchase. I asked if they'd found anything left behind when they'd moved in, any personal items or papers that might have belonged to previous residents, and they said the house had been completely cleared except for some boxes in the attic that they'd assumed were junk and had thrown away without examining the contents carefully. I felt a stab of frustration imagining what information might have been in those boxes, what other journals or photographs or documents might have filled in gaps in the story I was trying to piece together from the single journal I'd found and the fragments of memory from neighbors who'd known my father's second family decades ago. The property records at the new Hanover County Courthouse showed that the Greenfield Street house had been purchased in 1998 by Catherine Ann Morrison, with no co-buyer listed on the deed despite the mortgage documents showing a co-signer whose name had been redacted in the public records. The mortgage had been taken out for $200,000, a substantial sum in 1998, and the monthly payments would have required significant income to sustain, more than a nurse's salary alone could have supported unless Catherine had been working extensive overtime or had other sources of income that weren't reflected in the public records I could access. The foreclosure documents from 2009 showed that the mortgage had gone into default in late 2006, that the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings in 2007, and that the house had been sold at auction in 2010 after sitting vacant for several years while the legal process worked its way through the courts. I wondered what had happened to Catherine and the children after the foreclosure, where they'd gone, and whether they'd stayed in Wilmington or relocated to another city, and whether the financial collapse that had led to losing the house was connected to whatever had caused my father's journal entries to stop in 2006, around the same time the mortgage payments had apparently ceased. I found Catherine Morrison's name in nursing license records at the North Carolina Board of Nursing, showing she'd been licensed in 1985 and had maintained active status until 2007, when her license had lapsed and had never been renewed. The board's public records showed no disciplinary actions or complaints against her license, just a notation that she'd failed to complete the continuing education requirements for renewal and had allowed the license to expire. I searched for her in current databases and social media platforms, but found no recent traces of Catherine Morrison in North Carolina or in neighboring states, no active profiles or public records that would indicate where she was living now or what she'd been doing for the past 15 years since her nursing license had lapsed. The absence of information was frustrating and also slightly ominous, suggesting either that Catherine had remarried and changed her name, had moved far from North Carolina and established a life in a different region, or had died sometime after 2007 without leaving the kind of digital footprint that most people accumulate in the modern era through social media and public records and online presence. The children's names from the journal, Emma and Michael Morrison, were common enough that searching for them without additional identifying information produced thousands of results that were impossible to narrow down to the specific individuals I was looking for. I tried searching for Emma Morrison in combination with Wilmington and piano, hoping that if she'd pursued music professionally, there might be records of performances or teaching credentials, but found nothing that seemed to match the time frame or the biographical details I knew from my father's journal entries. Michael Morrison produced even more results, with the baseball connection providing no useful filter, since youth sports rarely generated the kind of lasting public records that would help me locate someone decades after they'd played Little League in Wilmington. I felt stuck, holding a journal that documented 14 years of my father's secret life, but unable to find the people who'd shared that life with him, unable to locate the half-siblings I'd never known existed until I'd found evidence of their existence hidden in a box of gardening tools. I hired a private investigator with experience in locating people who'd gone off the grid, or who'd deliberately tried to erase their presence from public records, and she took the information I had about Catherine and the children, and promised to conduct a thorough search using databases and resources that weren't available to ordinary citizens. 3 weeks later she called with information that Catherine Ann Morrison had died in 2012 in a car accident in Virginia, that she'd been living in Richmond under her maiden name Catherine Ann Fletcher at the time of her death, and that she'd been survived by 2 adult children whose names were listed in the obituary as Emma Fletcher and Michael Fletcher, suggesting they'd also reverted to their mother's maiden name at some point after leaving Wilmington. The investigator said she'd found social media profiles for both Emma and Michael, that Emma was living in Charlotte working as a middle school music teacher, and that Michael was in Raleigh working in commercial construction, and she provided contact information if I wanted to reach out to them directly to explain who I was and what I'd discovered about our shared connection to the man we'd all known as our father. I spent a week trying to decide whether to contact Emma and Michael, whether they deserved to know that their father had been living a double life and that they had a half-sister they'd never met, or whether reaching out would only cause pain and confusion by forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their family history. The investigator had found that Catherine's obituary made no mention of a husband or ex-husband, had listed her as preceded in death only by her parents, and I wondered if my father had disappeared from their lives completely by 2012, or if they'd known he was still alive somewhere, but had chosen not to acknowledge him publicly in the death notice. I wondered if Catherine had known about me and my mother, if she'd discovered my father's double life, and that discovery had led to the financial collapse and the foreclosure and the eventual move to Virginia under her maiden name, or if she'd lived her entire relationship with my father believing he was exactly who he claimed to be, and had died never knowing the full extent of his deception. I decided to contact Emma first, sent her a carefully worded email explaining that I was researching family history and had discovered information suggesting we might be related through my father, who I believed had known her mother Catherine in Wilmington in the 1990s and early 2000s. And I asked if she'd be willing to talk with me about her memories of that time and about what had happened to her family after they'd left Wilmington. Emma responded 3 days later with a message that was cautious but not hostile, saying she remembered very little about her father, who had left when she was 14 and who she'd never heard from again, that her mother had told her and Michael that he'd abandoned them for another family, and that they shouldn't waste energy trying to understand or track down someone who'd made it clear he didn't want to be part of their lives. Emma said she'd made peace with that abandonment years ago, had built a life that didn't depend on having answers about why her father had left or where he'd gone, but that she was curious about what I'd found and would be willing to meet if I thought the information would provide closure or context that might be helpful. We met at a coffee shop in Charlotte on a Saturday morning in October, and the resemblance between us was immediately apparent despite our different mothers and the different circumstances of our upbringings. Emma had my father's eyes and his way of gesturing with her hands when she talked, the same physical mannerisms that I saw in myself when I looked in mirrors or watched videos of myself speaking. She brought photographs of her childhood with my father, images that paralleled the ones I'd grown up with, showing a man who appeared in both our lives, but who had somehow managed to keep those lives completely separate and prevent either family from discovering the other's existence. Emma said she'd been confused for years about why her father had left, had blamed herself, and had wondered what she'd done wrong to drive him away, and it had taken extensive therapy in her 20s to accept that his departure had been about his own failures and his own choices, rather than about anything she or Michael or their mother had done or failed to do. I showed Emma the journal, let her read entries about herself and Michael and their mother, and watched her process the realization that our father had been documenting the life he'd shared with them while simultaneously maintaining a completely separate existence with me and my mother less than 2 miles away. Emma said the journal entries felt like they'd been written about someone else's family, that the man who'd written those affectionate observations about piano lessons and baseball games didn't match the person who'd walked out in 2006 without explanation or forwarding address, who'd never sent birthday cards or made any effort to stay connected to the children he'd apparently cared about enough to write about in private journals. She asked about my childhood with our father, whether he'd been present and involved or distant and absent, and I said he'd been there physically but emotionally remote in ways I'd attributed to his personality, but that now seemed like the inevitable result of dividing his attention and his emotional energy between two families that each required the commitment and presence of a full parent. Emma said her mother had discovered the truth about my father's double life in 2006, had found evidence of another family through mail that had been delivered to their house by mistake, an insurance statement listing beneficiaries that included my mother and me alongside Catherine and Emma and Michael. Catherine had confronted my father with the evidence, Emma said, and he'd admitted to maintaining 2 families and had said he couldn't choose between them, that he loved both his wives and all his children and couldn't imagine life without any of them. Catherine had given him an ultimatum, Emma remembered overhearing through her bedroom door, had said he needed to decide which family he wanted to be with and cut ties completely with the other, that she wouldn't continue sharing him and living with the deception and the constant anxiety that someone would discover the truth and expose them all to scandal and judgment. My father had apparently been unable or unwilling to make that choice, Emma said, and had instead chosen to leave both families, to disappear rather than admit to either wife that she hadn't been his only commitment and that everything she'd believed about their marriage had been based on carefully maintained lies. Emma said she and Michael had blamed their mother for driving their father away, had been angry with her for years about the ultimatum and about what they'd perceived as her unwillingness to compromise or forgive. And it had only been after Catherine's death in 2012 that Emma had found letters and journals explaining the full situation and helping her understand that their mother had been a victim of my father's deception rather than the cause of his departure. Those letters had revealed that Catherine had known about the double life for several months before confronting my father, had been gathering evidence and trying to understand the full scope of what he'd been doing, and had consulted with lawyers about her options for divorce and for protecting herself financially from the fallout that would come when the truth became public. Catherine had been terrified about losing the house and being unable to support Emma and Michael on her nurse's salary alone, Emma said, and that fear had paralyzed her and had kept her from acting immediately when she'd first discovered the evidence of my father's other family. I asked Emma if she wanted to meet our father, if she had any interest in confronting him about what he'd done or in trying to build some kind of relationship now that we all knew the truth. and she was quiet for a long time before saying she didn't know what purpose that would serve. She said their father was living in assisted living after his stroke, that his memory was impaired and his ability to communicate was limited, and that confronting him now would be like confronting a different person than the one who'd made the choices that had shaped their lives. Emma said she'd thought about trying to contact him over the years, had imagined conversations where she'd ask him to explain himself and account for the pain he'd caused, but that she'd always decided the answers wouldn't be satisfying or meaningful, because no explanation could justify abandoning his children or living the kind of elaborate deception that had defined his adult life. She said she preferred to remember her father the way he'd been during the good years before he'd left, the man who'd helped with homework and attended her piano recitals and made her feel loved and valued, and that visiting him now in his diminished state would only replace those memories with images of confusion and decline that wouldn't add anything useful to her understanding of who he'd been or why he'd made the choices he'd made. Michael agreed to meet with me the following week, and he was less interested in processing the emotional dimensions of our father's double life than in understanding the practical logistics of how someone could maintain two complete families in the same city for 14 years without either family discovering the deception. Michael worked in construction and approached problems with a systematic mindset, and he wanted to map out our father's schedule and his financial arrangements and the physical movements that would have been necessary to keep the two households separated and prevent accidental encounters between the families. We sat at his kitchen table with calendars and maps, reconstructing what we knew about our father's daily life from my journal and Emma's memories and my own recollections, and we realized that our father had been incredibly disciplined and organized in ways that seemed almost pathological in their attention to detail and planning. Michael figured out that our father had worked as a commercial insurance adjuster, a job that had required him to visit clients and accident sites throughout the region, and that had provided perfect cover for the irregular schedule needed to maintain two families. My father had apparently told my mother that his work required evening appointments and weekend inspections, while telling Catherine that his job involved early morning meetings and overnight trips to handle claims in distant parts of the state, and by carefully coordinating those explanations, he'd been able to be present in both households, without either wife questioning why he wasn't available at certain times or on certain days. Michael said the level of planning and deception required to sustain that schedule would have been exhausting, that our father must have lived in constant fear of making a mistake or of being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that the cognitive load of maintaining separate stories and separate identities for 14 years must have been enormous. The financial logistics were even more complex, Michael discovered by examining property records and mortgage documents, and the fragmentary information we'd been able to gather about our father's income and expenses during the years he'd maintained both families. My father had earned a decent salary as an insurance adjuster, but not enough to support two mortgages and two families' worth of living expenses without taking on significant debt or finding additional income sources that weren't reflected in the public records we could access. Michael suspected our father had been embezzling from his employer or had been running some kind of insurance fraud scheme on the side, using his access to claims and client information to skim money in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious, and that the financial house of cards had been on the verge of collapse in 2006, around the time Catherine had discovered the truth and had confronted him with the ultimatum that had forced him to choose between his two families. Michael said he'd spent years being angry with our father for leaving, had channeled that anger into athletics and then into his work, and had built a life defined by reliability and commitment to his obligations, because he'd wanted to be nothing like the man who'd raised him for 14 years and then had disappeared without explanation. Learning now that their father had been maintaining a double life and had left not because of anything Michael or Emma or Catherine had done, but because his deception had become unsustainable, made the abandonment feel both more and less painful, Michael said, because it meant the choice hadn't been personal, but also meant their entire childhood had been built on a foundation of lies that invalidated everything they'd thought was true about their family. Michael said he had no interest in meeting our father, or in confronting him about what he'd done, that he'd made peace with the absence years ago, and didn't need closure or explanations from someone who'd proven himself incapable of honesty or accountability. I asked both Emma and Michael if they wanted to know about my experience growing up as our father's other child, whether it would help them to understand that I'd also been shaped by his choices and his deceptions, even though I'd been on the other side of the invisible wall he'd maintained between his two families. And they both said yes, that they wanted to understand the full scope of what he'd done and how the double life had affected everyone involved. I told them about my childhood in Wilmington, about living on Shipyard Boulevard, in a house less than 2 miles from where they'd been living on Market Street, and then Greenfield Street, about my father's irregular schedule and his frequent absences that my mother had explained as work requirements, and that I'd accepted without question because I'd had no reason to doubt what I was being told. I told them about my father's emotional distance, about the way he'd always seemed preoccupied and distracted even when he was physically present, and about how I'd assumed that was just his personality rather than recognizing it as the inevitable result of trying to be present in 2 places simultaneously. Emma said hearing about my experience helped her understand that their father had been distant with both families, that the emotional unavailability she'd experienced hadn't been unique to her or evidence that she'd failed to engage his interest, and that recognition provided some relief from the self-blame she'd carried for years about not being enough to keep her father engaged and present. Michael said it was strange to realize we'd been living parallel lives less than 2 miles apart, attending different schools but probably crossing paths at grocery stores or shopping centers without knowing we were siblings, moving through the same city in separate orbits that never intersected because our father had been so careful to keep his 2 worlds from touching. We spent hours comparing our memories, finding points where our timelines overlapped and trying to imagine what our father had been doing and thinking during periods when both families had needed him simultaneously. And the picture that emerged was of someone living in a constant state of stress and compartmentalization that must have been psychologically destructive, even as it allowed him to maintain the illusion of having 2 complete families. I visited my father at his assisted living facility 2 weeks after meeting with Emma and Michael, and I brought the journal with me, intending to confront him about what I'd discovered and to demand explanations for the choices he'd made. But when I sat down across from him in the common room and looked at his vacant expression and his confusion about who I was and why I was visiting, I realized that the person I wanted to confront no longer existed in any meaningful sense, that the stroke had erased so much of his memory and cognitive function that asking him to account for decisions made 20 years earlier was pointless. My father looked at the journal without recognition, flipped through pages filled with his own handwriting describing events and people he no longer remembered, and asked me politely who these people were and why I was showing him someone else's diary. I tried to explain that it was his journal, that it documented years of his life with a second family he'd maintained in secret, but he just looked confused and said he'd only ever had 1 family, just me and my mother, and that I must be mistaken about these other people. The staff at the assisted living facility said my father's memory problems were extensive, that the stroke had damaged areas of his brain responsible for long-term memory formation and retrieval, and that he had good days and bad days, but that overall his ability to recall events from more than a few years ago was severely compromised. They said he sometimes talked about people and events from his past, but that those recollections were fragmentary and often contradictory, mixing details from different periods and different contexts in ways that made it impossible to know what was accurate memory and what was confabulation or confusion. I asked if he'd ever mentioned Catherine or Emma or Michael, and the staff said no, that he'd only ever talked about my mother and me, that as far as they knew from his conversations he'd had a conventional family structure with 1 wife and 1 child and a career in insurance that had ended when he'd retired in his early 60s. I showed the staff the journal and explained what I'd discovered about my father's double life, and they were sympathetic but said there was no therapeutic benefit to forcing him to confront information he couldn't process or understand, that his current reality was the only one he had access to, and that introducing contradictory information would only cause distress and confusion without providing any meaningful resolution or closure. They suggested I might find more benefit in therapy or in talking with the half-siblings I'd discovered, in processing the revelation with people who could engage with it intellectually and emotionally, rather than trying to extract explanations or acknowledgement from someone whose capacity to provide those things had been destroyed by medical events beyond his control. I left the facility feeling frustrated and cheated, having discovered the truth about my father's secret life but being unable to confront him about it or to get the answers that might have helped me understand why he'd made the choices he'd made and how he'd lived with the deception for so many years. Emma, Michael and I have continued meeting regularly, getting to know each other as adults and as siblings despite the circumstances that prevented us from growing up together, and we've created a relationship that exists independently of our shared father and the complicated history that connects us. Emma introduced me to her children, my nieces and nephew, who are growing up knowing they have an aunt they'd never met until recently. And Michael has included me in family gatherings with his wife and his in-laws, who've accepted me as part of their extended family network despite the unusual circumstances of how I entered their lives. We've talked about whether to tell our father's broader family about what we've discovered, whether aunts and uncles and cousins deserve to know that the man they thought they knew had been living a secret life for 14 years. And we've decided to keep the information private for now, to avoid causing pain and confusion to elderly relatives who wouldn't benefit from learning the truth at this late stage. The house on Shipyard Boulevard where I grew up with my mother and father is still standing, occupied now by a family that knows nothing about the people who lived there before them or about the double life that was maintained from that location for more than a decade. My mother died in 2018, 3 years before I discovered my father's journal, and I've wondered whether she knew about Catherine and the other children, whether she'd suspected or had discovered evidence that she'd chosen not to confront because she'd feared the consequences of forcing my father to choose between his two families. I've gone through my mother's papers and belongings looking for any indication that she'd known, any letters or journal entries or financial records that would suggest awareness of my father's deception. But I've found nothing that definitively answers that question. My mother's sister, my aunt who lives in Florida, has said that my mother occasionally made comments about my father's absences and his secretive nature, that she'd worried he might be having an affair but had never pursued those suspicions because she'd been afraid of what she might discover. The journal entries stop abruptly in October 2006, mid-sentence in an entry describing plans to take Emma to look at colleges, and there's no explanation for why my father stopped writing or what happened in the weeks and months after that final entry. Based on what Emma told me about the timeline of Catherine discovering the double life and confronting my father, I believe he stopped writing in the journal when his secret was exposed, when the careful compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain two families simultaneously collapsed, and he could no longer pretend that both lives could continue indefinitely. The financial records show that Catherine's mortgage went into default shortly after that final journal entry, supporting the timeline that my father had left both families around the same time and had stopped supporting either household financially. And I've wondered where he went and how he supported himself during the years between 2006 when he abandoned both families and 2015 when he moved back to Wilmington and re-established contact with my mother and me, as if nothing had happened. My father had returned to Wilmington in 2015, saying he'd been working in Atlanta and had decided to retire and come back to the coast, where he'd spent most of his life. And my mother had accepted that explanation without apparent skepticism, even though she and my father had been divorced since 2008 and hadn't maintained close contact during his absence. He'd rented an apartment and had started showing up at family gatherings again, had reconnected with me and had made efforts to be present in my adult life in ways he'd never managed during my childhood, and I'd attributed his increased engagement to aging and to regrets about time he'd wasted being emotionally unavailable. Now I wonder if his return had been motivated by loneliness or guilt, by the recognition that he'd destroyed both his families and that trying to rebuild some connection with the family he'd grown up in was better than spending his final years completely alone. My father never mentioned Catherine or Emma or Michael during those years between 2015 and his stroke in 2022, never gave any indication that he'd had another family or that he'd maintained a double life for 14 years, and I'd had no reason to suspect anything unusual about his past until I'd found the journal hidden among gardening tools in his garage. The brick ranch on Market Street where Catherine and the children had lived in the early years of my father's double life has been renovated again, the current owners having added a second story and completely transformed the property's exterior appearance, and there's no visible trace remaining of the family that occupied that house from 1992 to 1998. The split level on Greenfield Street where they'd moved in 1998 still looks much as it did in photographs from that era, and I've driven past it several times trying to imagine what life was like inside that house during the final years before Catherine discovered the truth and the whole arrangement collapsed. I think about my father driving between houses, between families, maintaining separate wardrobes and separate stories and separate versions of himself that never quite overlapped. And I try to understand what kind of person is capable of that level of sustained deception, while also being capable of the genuine affection evident in his journal entries about piano lessons and baseball games and the ordinary moments of family life. Emma has said she thinks our father loved both families in his own way, that the journal entries and her memories of him during her childhood suggest genuine engagement and care, even if the foundation of that engagement was built on lies and deception. Michael is less generous, believes our father was fundamentally selfish, and that his maintenance of two families was about satisfying his own needs, rather than about love or commitment to anyone other than himself. That he kept both families because he enjoyed the validation and the sense of being needed and important, rather than because he felt genuine attachment to the people whose lives he was shaping through his choices. I find myself somewhere between those two interpretations, believing our father was capable of both genuine feeling and profound selfishness, that he loved his families but loved his freedom and his control more, that he valued being present in multiple lives even if that presence was necessarily diluted and compromised by the impossible logistics of trying to be in two places simultaneously. The question I keep returning to is whether my childhood would have been better or worse if my father had chosen Catherine's family over ours in 2006, when he'd been forced to confront the unsustainability of his double life. Whether I would have been better off having him disappear completely, rather than having him return in 2015 and re-establish a limited relationship that never addressed the years he'd been absent, or the reasons he'd left. Emma says she's glad their father left when he did, that discovering the truth at 14 had been painful, but had allowed her to build her adult identity without the complications of maintaining a relationship with someone whose fundamental dishonesty would have contaminated everything they shared. Michael says he wishes he'd never known about the double life, that learning the truth 30 years after the fact hasn't provided closure or healing, but has just replaced one set of painful questions with another, has made him question all his memories of childhood and wonder which moments were real and which were performances our father was delivering to maintain his elaborate deception. I've decided not to confront my father again about what I discovered in the journal, not to try to force him to acknowledge or explain his double life, even if his memory improves to the point where he could engage with those questions meaningfully. The person who made those choices and lived that deception is gone, whether because of the stroke or because of the passage of time, and demanding accountability from someone who no longer has access to the memories or the reasoning that led to those choices feels pointless and cruel. Instead, I've focused on building relationships with Emma and Michael, on creating connections that exist independently of our shared father, and that might provide some redemption or meaning from the wreckage of his choices. We've talked about telling our children the truth about their grandfather's double life, about being honest with the next generation about the complicated history that shaped our families, and we've agreed that honesty is better than the kind of selective silence that allowed our father's deception to remain hidden for so many years. The journal stays in a locked drawer in my desk, a document I occasionally reread when I'm trying to understand my father, or when I need to remind myself that people are capable of simultaneously loving their families and betraying them, that the capacity for tenderness and the capacity for deception can coexist in the same person without necessarily contradicting each other. I've shown the journal to my own children, have explained that their grandfather maintained two families and that they have cousins they never knew about until recently, and I've tried to help them understand that family is complicated and that people make choices that hurt others, even when they don't intend that harm, that understanding those choices doesn't require forgiving them, but does require acknowledging the full humanity of the people who made them. My oldest daughter asked me if I thought my father had been a good person or a bad person, and I said I thought he'd been both and neither, that he'd been capable of genuine kindness and genuine cruelty, and that reducing him to a simple moral judgment would miss the complexity of what he'd actually been and what he'd actually done. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation where we uncover the secret families that people maintain in the same cities where their official families live and discover the impossible logistics of double lives that depend on careful planning and sustained deception across years and decades.